Hi, I'm Tony.
And I'm Patrick.
And we are here with the Cave to the Cross Apologetics, and we are working our way through Jason Lyle's book, Keeping Faith in an Age of Reason. And actually, in our last episode, we finished the last chapter, and so now we're just looking at his closing remarks with regard to this particular book. We thought we've had a great time working our way through this book. He gives us 420 alleged contradictions that the critics raise. Now, we didn't go through all of those. He does in this book, and again, so it's probably worth your while to take a look at it. But the ones that we've said clearly shows that the critic did not do their homework. Right?
Yeah, we're still faithful, unfortunately, for them, I guess.
Yeah.
I guess that's their point.
So in the closing remarks, he does a couple of things here. He kind of looks at all the various errors that the critic has made. In fact, they say that the critic says that there are 420 examples of contradictions in the Bible. He finds 615 errors that the critic makes when they're trying to discover these various alleged contradictions. So, go figure, right? If we're just counting noses or numbers, we win, right?
Yeah.
He gives a list at the back here of the various errors. At the top of the list is the clear one, which is failure to read the text carefully or in context, right? And that's the biggest error that he talks about.
Right. And as we were going through that, it's one thing if you have a friend who's coming to you in confidence says, hey, I have a question about this. There could be a read text carefully or in context, and then there are people that you might encounter with on the internet who don't have as much of a relationship with you and might be asking you in a hostile manner. So obviously it's up to you to kind of purse how aggressively you want to answer questions. But hopefully someone is coming to you in a kind of a respectful manner where they're just not doing the full-on reading. They're just kind of taking a list like what he pulls from here at face value and doesn't read two verses on either side of it. And so this book helps you to kind of focus exactly where to point people as to how to answer the question.
Yeah, good. All right, so so he mentions here that he says after looking at the various errors that the critic makes, he comes to this kind of conclusion. He says, the above considerations prompt us to ask, do Bible critics do any legitimate research on the issues, right? We can only conclude from this study, he says, that at least most critics do not. This oft-repeated examples, these various ones, are not carefully researched at all. It should be clear that most of the examples on the list were very obviously not contradictory at all when read in context. Only 9, that is 2%, require us to consult the original language to resolve any perceived problems, and only 8 require textual transmission analysis to resolve them, right? And so he says, if this is the best that the critic has to offer, then the Christian worldview really has no serious competition at all. Right?
Which I think probably the biggest new surgence in Bible criticism is probably Bart Ehrman, just from his backstory. And so many people I know kind of refer to him as kind of a throwaway line of, well, in Ehrman's book, Misquoting Jesus, or in his book here, he has this that says, whatever contradiction there is. And so a lot of times they can be kind of couched in a more scholarly fashion, but most of the times you're encountering questions like this. So even within Ehrman's books, there are presuppositions he holds to that other people have written books that responded to. I think who's the guy that we like that's written on everything? Klosterman or
well, he's done it.
Yeah.
Boy, I tell you, his name escapes me now, but we'll put his information below so that people can get aware of it, be aware of it. It'll come to me
once I look it up.
Yeah. And as we go through the thing, what What I find interesting though, and what Lyle ends on, is he doesn't say this, but I think what he's getting at is oftentimes we let the critic get away with too much, right? We argue at a level of evidence when we should be arguing at a worldview level, a presuppositional level. For instance, the critic has raised the issue of contradiction, right? The Bible has contradiction, right? And Lyle rightly points out there's a profound irony in the critic's list of supposed Bible contradictions. The critic is providing this list presumably to convince people that the Bible is wrong. So his argument, he says, could go something like this. Contradictions are always wrong. The Bible has contradictions. Therefore, the Bible is wrong. Well, okay. All right. That might be the case. But here's the problem, right? He says you realize that premise 1 in the above argument, contradictions are always wrong, is a biblical truth, right? In other words, the contradiction is one of the major laws of logic, right? And so what we need to do sometimes in these situations is step back, and we need to ask the critic, all right, fine, why is it wrong? Why are contradictions wrong? In fact, how do you justify the laws of logic in general, right? And so we step back and, now we have an answer as Christians, right? We can say that the laws of logic reflect the way that God thinks, right? So, we have an answer for this. The basic laws of logic are clear. They're part of the biblical truth because they're based on the character of God, right? Laws of logic are God's standards for thinking. And so, since God is unchangeable, sovereign, immaterial being, his thoughts would necessarily be abstract, universal, and unthinking and unchanging, right? So and so just as God's character's characterized like that, and he's characterized like that, his various standards for thinking is characterized like that. In other words, they're not made out of matter. They are they apply everywhere and at all times. But we need to ask the critic, why do they think? What is their reasoning for holding to laws of logic, right? Rational reasoning would be impossible without the laws of logic, and the laws of logic would not exist without the biblical God.
Right. So just like someone who claims, I'm trying to think of Dawkins. Dawkins is a pure naturalist. He says that there's nothing that could possibly exist outside of nature and
the physical universe.
What you see and feel and touch and smell is what you get. However, we run into an issue when you then say, okay, well, what about the laws of logic? Because how do you see, smell, taste, and touch the laws of logic?
Yeah.
Well, even within his own worldview, he cannot account for those laws or things like morality. Should I cheat on my wife? Should I kill somebody? There's no materialistic substance you can kind of point to that says, this
one action is right and one action is wrong. They're all actions.
They are actions
from a naturalistic point of view, and the only way, you could say, well, I don't like,
right.
that sort of thing. But what makes it this particular action a bad or a good action or something like that, right? That's the issue. And so you kind of have to take a step back and ask them to defend their worldview, really, is what we're getting at here.
Right. Yeah. So even with this contradiction, the statement about the law of non-contradictions, you can ask them, well, how do you know that? By what application, or what are you appealing to that says I can prove that the law of non-contradictions is true? Well, for them just to go, well, I just know it. Well, you could just take the same approach and say, well, I know it too, and I have a different reason. So I just know that it's God that causes us to be able to appeal to the law of non-contradiction. So you're just appealing to personal experience isn't really going to cut it, because, again, people have different experiences. And in fact, postmodernism kind of hinges on that. And so a true postmodernist who adheres to his own worldview would say, you're right, and also I can't prove one way or the other if the law of non-contradiction is accurate. So even within that mindset there, is it true for me and true for you? Yes. Well, there's a positive statement as well. So even when you approach a person who's trying to get away from standardizations of truth, and they're trying to say, here's a third option, even within their presuppositional worldview, they're failing to adhere to their own worldview. So they're being inconsistent, and inconsistency is a sign of a failed argument.
Yeah.
So what you can also say is,
So basically, you were saying they can't really appeal to their experience.
Right.
I just know it. Right.
Right.
Because we could, if that's the case, that's clearly an argument stopper, right? That how do you just know it, and why do you just know it, and why do you know? Okay, you may know it now. Will it be the same in the future? Right. That's the kind of stuff.
Yeah, and so Lyle has a really great paragraph here that pretty much boils down one of his main books into, well, I should say half of it, one of his books that we've read, talking about how we know this just from the Bible. What of God's character allows us to have confidence in things like science, the laws of logic, and morality? It's only through having a correct understanding of who God is and understanding His character that we're able to appeal to it, because to appeal to something outside of God is to declassify God as a God, because then the blind watchmaker is the one who tells God what to enforce. Okay, so we should be worshiping the blind watchmaker because he has power over God in some fashion. Or if they're just arbitrary means, then for God to say that Mars is in the sky today and the Mars is underneath the Earth tomorrow is entirely possible. And so does the Bible talk about God in that fashion? No, it talks about His character being consistent and unchanging, and even though He acts in nature, science is the way that He sees the world. Laws of logic is how God thinks, and morality is the way that God commands us from His own character, His own consistent character, to act. And so when we fall outside of those is what we would call being wrong or sinning, depending on if it's a moral standpoint. It's saying 2 + 2 = 5. When you're 4 years old is not a sin, but you're falling outside of how God thinks in that fashion. So when even school, you take the most strict communistic behind the Iron Curtain, and you give a kid a list of problems, and 2 + 2 = 4. Why do you put a green check mark next to it and not and a red X next to someone who says 5? If truth is just all relative, and we should be lambasting teachers for being inconsiderate to our precious little ones.
Being dogmatic.
Yeah.
Toward
It's just terrible.
Yeah.
Well, how do you have this understanding of what the world is made of, and how we can come to know things? Nancy Pearcey in one of her books that we did, Finding Truth, talks about kind of this application of you have a box, and if you can fit all the things within your worldview into the box, and there's nothing outside of it that escapes it, then you have a consistent worldview. And so that's a good thing to have, because you're consistent and you're able to appeal to it. But if things fall outside of it, saying,
so for instance, the only thing that exists is a material universe. That's my box, right? Well, there are lots of things that fall outside of the box, like the laws of logic, right?
Other minds, the mind, consciousness, laws of logic, good and evil. If you say something is good or evil, or even I even say that most truth claims come down to a moral claim, because I'm trying to give you truth. Well, is that good or bad? I think it's good to give people the truth. So 2 + 2 = 4 is a truth claim, and I think it's also a moral claim. And so those things fall outside of a box for postmodernist or naturalistic worldview person. And so we can't appeal to things like our experience because experiences aren't universal. I've never been to the moon, but I'm assuming other people went to the moon.
Yeah. I've never died, but I guess I'm gonna die one day. But I've never experienced that.
Yes, I'm pretty sure a truck that would hit me would hurt, although I've never been hit by a truck. Those type of things is or you can't appeal to past experiences, which we see even in the scientific community. What's true today has always been true. But even within their own worldview, that's not been the case, because if you subscribe to thoughts like evolution, you could have punctuated equilibrium or panspermia again. You can have these appeals to quick, the Cambrionic explosion. Where did all these things come from in a quick period of time? Or, you can say, well, the princess and the frog. The princess kissed the frog and suddenly there was a prince. Oh, nope, that's fairy tale.
Right.
Well, how is that when, over millions of years you could have that, right? So what if you had this, punctuated equilibrium where a kiss mixed the DNA of the princess to the frog and suddenly you got a handsome prince? It's entirely possible within that. Or, by what basis do you say it's impossible? So experiences of all humanity are not universal. So Lau goes on to say, so the unbeliever is quite in a bind. On one hand, he wants to argue against the Bible on the basis that it has what he believes to be contradictions. On the other hand, apart from the truth of the Bible, there would be no basis for arguing that contradictions are always wrong. Why? Because the Bible presents the clearest, most consistent form of argument that explains things like the laws of logic. So even starting at the first premise in his argument against the Bible assumes that the Bible is the case. Yeah. So God is evil, to be evil is to be wrong. God is evil in the Bible, therefore God is wrong. To assume any of those points assumes a worldview that the person cannot have. If they're a naturalist, what is evil? What is good? How do you define those things? And there are books that try to do that and say, whatever supports survival. So we see that in
whatever brings harm
in Dawkins' book.
Survival of whom? Let's say bacteria.
Right. Or to say,
is it okay that
or species?
Or do we? Why do we privilege the human beings? Right. If there are other species, right?
Mm-hmm, right. Yeah, and you could say that we're both a benefit and a harm depending on how you look at it. Yeah. So why is that the case? Or we see with science, science has changed and has not. To say the way that science is done has changed, and so to be dogmatic in on how we approach science is we can't say we can't say we've always used the scientific method. We found a better way, and so far the scientific method seems to work. But what if we discover that 222nd dimension of string theory, and all of a sudden theorems go out the window, and we're just presented with cold brute facts or contradictory items to our eyes? How do we look at those things? So, Schrodinger's cat kind of hints at that. Yeah. You can hold two
hat
two
or
things.
His cat?
Well, either one.
Oh, okay.
Whatever you put in the box.
It's Schrodinger's hat and the cat in the hat.
Yes. So to rationally resolve this issue, the unbeliever would have to either, one, embrace the truth of the Bible, which they cannot do. That's what they're arguing against. Or they would have to reject the premise that contradictions are always false, in which case that person would not be able to cogently argue that the Bible is wrong for
so the
allegedly
issue,
having
right, exactly. So the issue is, why are contradictions wrong,
mm-hmm.
right? And how do you justify the claim that contradictions are wrong?
Sure.
Do you justify it by your experience? All the contradictions that I've experienced so far have been wrong. Okay, that's fine. What about in the future? Things change. How do we know that won't be the case in the future, right? Well, that's silly. Well, is it? I mean, that's an your worldview needs to take that into consideration. The Christian worldview says we know contradictions are wrong. It's because they violate the character of God. You say based on your experience, but you haven't experienced everything. In fact, universal human experience hasn't experienced everything. especially the future.
Right.
At one time, universal human experience said that the sun circled the earth, right? Well, clearly, universal human experience, if we want to say it that way, was wrong, right? I mean, the earth spins. That's why we see the sun seems to move in terms of it. So why are contradictions wrong? How do we know they're wrong? How do we know they'll continue to be wrong? Well, how do you justify that, right? It's a silly question. No, it's a question about the consistency of your worldview. Does your worldview allow you to consistently and coherently answer those types of questions? Right? If it doesn't, you need to consider a different worldview. Right. The Christian has an answer.
So that's why in episode 13 we talked about this. Don't answer. You're more than welcome and free, and Lyle's book is a testament to that, to answer the objection that is raised. However, there are a means by which we can actually take a step back from that question and say, well, let's not answer according to what standard you present. God in the Bible commands the slaughter of innocent people. Okay, well, yes, he does, and let's try and make a way for us to not talk about this in a strict legalistic manner. Or we can say, okay, first of all, why is killing of innocents wrong? And also, what do you determine as innocence? Because within that question, there's the assumption that who God commanded Israel to kill were innocent people. And we know from just our study in last episode was there's no one righteous, no, not one. So according to in God's mind, in God's standard, there's no one who's innocent except Christ. And so,
and it's a moral question. Why, what is the standard, the moral standard that's being violated, and who determines that that's the standard? Do I individually? Do we collectively as a nation, a society? Who determines what the standard is, right? And can the standard change? And what's the basis of the standard?
Yeah.
Well, the Christian has an answer. Standard is the character of God.
Pluto was a planet. Pluto is no longer a planet. Long live Pluto.
Yeah.
Yes.
So good. So that's kind of how Lyle ends this particular book with this, kind of going through here and what he calls closing remarks with regard to this. And he challenges from a worldview, presuppositional perspective, the unbeliever to justify even the claim that contradictions are wrong.
Right. So, like with evidentialists, there's the ability to just answer question upon question upon question, but there's also kind of the way to go. Okay, unbeliever, you say that evidence is in your camp. Okay, you can take that evidence. Well, do we honestly believe that person has evidence of God not existing, or God being evil, or God being contradictory? Or do we actually have a way to answer that? And so this presents the most coherent and logically consistent within a person who believes in Christ's approach to how to answer those questions as far as, is there evidence outside of God's order, I guess.
Yeah. I mean, there's nothing wrong with arguing evidence against evidence. You got to know a whole lot of stuff, right? Mm-hmm. But when you challenge a person's worldview, you don't have to know a whole lot. You have basic questions. You get them to attempt to justify their worldview, basic presuppositions about the way things are. And you will find that the unbeliever cannot do that, right? They cannot do that.
Right. So that's why a lot of times just answering these types of questions might even be more beneficial within the confines of people who hold the same standard. So in church, how do we answer these questions amongst ourselves? You don't have to go, well, what's your presupposition? Well, we all share that same presupposition, so there's no point in going against that person for their presuppositions, unless it's to point out something like, well, God wants us to live all in love, and so what's true for me is not always true for everybody. Well, okay, then their understanding of who God is according to the Bible, which is our standard of revelation to us by God, is flawed, and so we should want to correct that. And so that's one of the reasons too that we meet together as a body of believers, is to make sure we're kind of on the same page, so to speak. In there.
And it should be clear, we're not saying that an unbeliever cannot reason.
Right.
And we're not saying
Right.
that an unbeliever cannot act morally.
Mm-hmm.
Right? That is not what we're saying.
Right.
We're asking, how do they justify?
Yeah. How do they consistently do those things?
Yeah. How do they justify the various claims that they want to hold to?
Mm-hmm.
Right? Within the perspective, especially if you're talking about a naturalistic worldview.
Right.
How do you justify those things?
Yeah. So I think we went through this. We mostly agreed with a lot of his answers on this. There was a few that we probably would want to reconsider, but I think even Lyle would say too that what he presents is kind of a shotgun approach as far as it comes to answers, because he's not answering completely. There's a ton of other books on there. Geisler has one. I think. F.F. Bruce or one of the other guys who's into Greek language tends to go through and offer, like when we talked about, does Paul hear the voice or do the men understand the voice? He delves down into the language aspect of it. So that, not to say that there aren't good questions to ask here, and in fact, we should also be concerned not with just the unbeliever, but also with those who fall outside into different religions, like Mormons and Jehovah's Witnesses and Muslims and Jewish people.
And the challenge is to ask them, how do they justify their worldview?
Yeah, that's one of the biggest ones. So we should worship God as the only God. Well, to a Mormon, yes, you're supposed to worship God because he's the only God that you're supposed to worship, but he's not the only God. Well, okay, then how do the laws of logic work in a world where there's almost an infinite number of gods? Who is the original God? Well, there's never been a time when there hasn't been. Okay, so there's no such thing as the beginning of time. Therefore, there's no way to get to this point in time, because we would have to have crossed an infinite number of time points to get to this time period. So there's where you can point to a contradiction within their worldview and say, because you have this presupposition, just the ability to say that there's a time when something happened is contradictory to that. So understanding a presuppositional worldview also gives you the ability to answer questions like who Christ is and who God is among people of different religions.
Yeah, good. All right.
Well, thank you very much for tuning in this time, and we appreciate you sharing this book with us. And until next time, we'll see you.
Yeah, stay tuned for our next little commercial that we'll do for the next book that we choose.
Yeah.
Have a good one.